is the U.S.-China relationship impacting global supply chains today? Per Hong is a partner and core member of the Strategic Operations and Transformation practice of Kearney. Hi, Per.
Hi, Robert. Good to join. Thank you for having me.
And good to talk to you again. So currently, Per, how would you characterize the current relationship between the U.S. and China with regard to trade?
Uh, the, the relationship between U.S. and China certainly has been heightening, and we've seen evidence of greater levels of tension that certainly has been emerging through the course of the last number of years. I mean, dating back to like 2016, if not before. Um, One of the key lessons learned, Robert, and I know you and I had opportunity to speak, last year and certainly before that. One of the key lessons learned from the COVID pandemic was how important international supply chains are.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it was PPE for healthcare systems or microchips for car productions or shortages from suppliers in the food system. It, it, that the impact that had on the relationship with China certainly is first and foremost. China, as your listeners may well be aware, is responsible for around 30% of global manufacturing output. It's dominant in almost all areas of manufacturing. It's critical as it keeps produces many parts and materials that keep American factories and assets moving. And so the impact on supply chains that we've experienced from China over the last couple of years is profound. The level of heightened competition and the tensions that exist between the two nations only further exacerbates or further accelerates some of those impacts.
Yeah, I mean, you cited COVID, but of course, as China has scrapped its drastic lockdown policies with regard to COVID, and supposedly things are up and running there and factories are up and running, I wonder if that's smoothing the supply chain disruptions that we saw between the two countries over the last 3 years. Are you seeing any positive move in that direction?
Well, it's smoothing some of the supply chain disruptions, certainly, as ports have reopened, manufacturing facilities and production has been smooth. Where there are still open questions, however, is how does the geopolitical tensions that exist between Sino and Chinese competition, the Sino and American competition, how does that continue to accelerate? What is the level of what the COVID crisis certainly highlighted was the level of connectedness that we have in our global system and the vulnerabilities that we have, particularly for certain critical parts, whether they be microchips or componentry or critical logistics systems. So a lot of the discussion that we've been having with clients, as well as what we've been observing through the work that we've been driving at the World Economic Forum and elsewhere, is further highlighting the need for re-examining the level of connectedness and what that means longer term for global supply chains and how they continue to be supported and managed.
Right. Well, you mentioned geopolitical issues. Let's talk about human rights to start. How is that affecting sourcing decisions in China by U.S. manufacturers and other manufacturers, because that concern is just becoming so pressing?
ESG factors are a critical scorecard measure for most companies now, and the impact that human rights has, the availability and treatment of workers, as well as some of the political dimensions that has is a component of that. I was recently facilitating a group of procurement leaders as part of a roundtable that we were facilitating, and we were having discussions in part around China and China sourcing and the implications and some of the changes that are being observed coming out of the last couple of years, as well as concerns politically around the dependence. And what I would say is there's a little bit of a balance, a yin and a yang, if you excuse the pun, if you will. On the one hand, cost, and particularly in a hyperinflationary environment that we've been experiencing, the need to continue to drive to lowest sources of supply is a critical driver in order to be able to preserve the margins and the revenue expectations that many of these companies have experienced. And we fully recognize that many of the products and services that are being procured are sourced from lower sources of labor supply in China or Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
But at the counter to that is a heightened acknowledgement of the risks associated with that supply and the ESG concerns and some of the political dimensions of being associated with that has longer term from a reputational point of view to be managed.
Hmm.
Um, and so that counterbalance is weighing heavily in the decisions. I think in the short term, the need, not having alternatives identified drives the short term cost decisions, but longer term, the opportunity to continue to find ways
Hmm.
to dual source or start to decouple the dependence becomes critical, and companies are starting to
Yeah,
explore those
well,
types of
I mean,
strategies.
there are options available now. I mean, most immediately, companies could go to Malaysia, to Vietnam, to India, to anyone, a number of other Asian countries that are qualify as so-called low-cost points of production. They could come to them back to this hemisphere and cut their logistics costs. They could go to Mexico because of lower labor rates in China, actually, these days, so I hear. And so I'm just wondering how concerns over human rights, concerns over supply chain resilience, the need for supplier diversification, is this manifesting itself right now in actual decisions by companies to reduce their reliance on production in China, or is it something we're still just talking about and might expect to see in years to come?
There are alternatives, as you mentioned. There are active discussions. I think it's something that we are actively talking about, but I think the action it's a little more complicated in many ways than just saying that there are alternative sources of supply. So
Mm-hmm.
take China's port and logistics network, for example. Companies from China own or operate 93 ports in 53 countries, including in Seattle and in Los Angeles. I mean, this provides China with a round-the-clock presence in global logistics shipping, particularly ocean, as we're moving forward, and really potential influence over how the flow of goods, including those in the U.S. and in Europe, start to be impacted. There are alternative sources of supply in Southeast Asia, but as you've cited, um, China also has a very strong, important presence in the development of those nations, many of whom are, you could almost call as client states of China. And so while China itself is a critical supplier of many components and raw materials, the influence that China has in a global domain is far, far more prevalent, as is the U.S., I
Yeah,
would add.
not just the question of
And
products moving between China and North America, but China's presence all over the world
it's a
through
lot more
big
sophisticated. So this
infrastructure
idea that we're
projects.
going to reduce reliance on
Right.
China and not source from a product, it's not quite as black and white as that. And certainly from a
Mm-hmm.
global supply chain design, and more important, from a functioning global economy perspective, that decoupling is really difficult to start to manage and execute.
Okay, but let's talk for a moment about the potentially most drastic scenario, whether or not that's going to happen, based on China's recent actions to exert more influence over the South China Sea, and the big one that everyone's worried about, China invading Taiwan.
Of course.
Nobody knows for sure what the likelihood of those things are. I'm just wondering, what is your perspective? How might that happen, and would that just blow up the whole thing?
Um, well, I learned a long time ago, Robert, to stop trying to procrastinate. And certainly none of us have a crystal ball
Mm-hmm.
that can predict the future. And even trying to, um, imagine what the likelihood of certain scenarios may or may not be. As a global supply chain practitioner, and particularly, as I started to describe the interconnectedness in the global economy, the level of pain that would be exerted not just on our economy but on China's as well,
Sure.
it is significant. And so the incentives for China to start to disrupt its global economic the global economic benefits that it does enjoy,
Hmm.
through the relationships that it has, is I think is high for maintaining some semblance of geopolitical stability, certainly in the region.
You would
Um,
like to think that the rational minds would prevail, knowing that everybody loses in a scenario like that. But then again, who would have predicted a couple of years ago an all-out war of Russia invading Ukraine? So we don't know for sure, do we?
no, we don't know for sure, and so the risk exists, and
Hmm.
so how companies and businesses prepare to manage those risks, I think, is certainly important.
Yeah.
Developing capacity in alternative locations in the region with similar capabilities to diversify or offset that risk that China may pose. So considering kind of a China plus one strategy is
Hmm.
really important. Prioritizing how you are directing investment in R&D to be able to manage those skills and develop the markets. Engaging proactively with government officials to be able to share perspectives, I think, are all important steps that companies should be taking now in order to be able to manage and mitigate the potential risks,
Yeah.
even if even in the unlikely event that they may occur, there's still measures and steps that advanced companies and advanced supply chains are taking and
Okay.
should
Well, the
be
message I'm getting here is that companies simply can't afford to be complacent, that it's not going to
absolutely.
be business as usual, that options need to be considered and in some cases taken and in a very uncertain future. But Per Hong of Kearney, always good to speak with you. And thank you for kind of laying out for us what are some of the big issues that we do need to be thinking about today in order to create more resilient supply chains in a time of geopolitical unrest. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure to be here, Robert. Thank you very much for having us.